Good afternoon. I'd like to call this meeting of the Standing Committee on Accountability and Oversight to order. My name is Kevin O'Reilly. I'm the MLA for Frame Lake and chair of the committee. We'll start with a prayer, and I'm going to do it this afternoon. Thanks. If you wish to experience peace, provide peace for another. If you wish to know you are safe, cause another to know that they are safe. If you wish to understand seemingly incomprehensible things, help another to understand. If you wish to heal your own sadness or anger, seek to heal the sadness or anger of another. Dalai Lama. Okay. We have a single item on the agenda for the meeting. This afternoon, committee will receive a public presentation from the Honourable Carolyn Cochrane, Premier of the Northwest Territories, on emerging stronger, the economic recovery strategy. Can I get a motion to approve the agenda, or first of all, are there any additions, changes to the agenda?
It's Frida.
Please, Ms. Martellus, go ahead.
I wonder if in the in-camera matters that we could have B. I just want to discuss one of the items that's in the news, and I want clarity on it.
Okay, thanks. We will add another item under the in-camera matters, new business. With that change to the agenda, can I get a motion to move the agenda? Ms. Cleveland, did I see your hand up? Thank you. Any objections? Okay, the motion, the agenda is approved as amended. Before we begin the meeting, any declarations of conflict of interest? Not seeing or hearing any. We'll, so today's meeting is being live streamed on the Assembly's social media channels. To respect physical distancing requirements, our witnesses are here in the room with us, but further down the table. It's a little cooler in here, as I understand. But a number of the members of the committee are appearing remotely. I just want to note for the record that there is a distinction between emerging stronger, which is what we're going to be talking about today, the economic and social recovery strategy, and emerging wisely, which is the public health related matters in terms of our response as a government to COVID and the public health measures as well. That document was released on June the 9th, but we're here today to talk about emerging stronger, the economic and social recovery strategy. So I'd like to remind all members and our witnesses that all comments, questions and remarks should be directed to myself as chair. Both members and witnesses will need to wait to be recognized by the chair before speaking. I'll now ask the committee members to introduce themselves for the record, and perhaps I could start with Ms. Cleveland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My name is Caitlin Cleveland, and I serve the people of Cam Lake.
Thanks, Ms. Cleveland. I see MLA Johnson. Do you want to go ahead?
Rylan Johnson, MLA for Yellowknife North.
Thanks, and I believe we have a couple of MLAs joining us by phone. Ms. Semler, are you on the line?
Yeah, can you hear me? It's Lisa Semler, MLA for Nuvik Twin Lakes.
Great, yes, thanks very much, Ms. Semler, for joining us. Is there anyone else? Oh, sorry, Ms. Martellus, you're on the line with us today as well?
Frida Martellus, MLA for Tabacha.
Thanks very much, Ms. Martellus. We're joined by a number of our staff in the room here today. We've got committee clerk Cynthia James with us. We've got research intern James Thomas, and a committee clerk in training Jean Uris, and our head of Research, Mr. Stephen Dunbar. Thanks very much. I'm now going to invite the Premier to proceed with any opening remarks that you may have.
Can you hear me, Mr. Chair? Do I have to push a button? I'm good.
Someone there.
I do have to push it?
So if it doesn't come on, feel free to press the button.
Can you? You're good. I'm good now? Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm pleased to provide this presentation to the Standing Committee on Accountability and Oversight at this public hearing on the Government of the Northwest Territories Pandemic Recovery Plan, Emerging Stronger, Planning the NWT's Social and Economic Recovery Together. I have appreciated the feedback from committee on the draft plan, which resulted in a number of changes, which you saw in the document tabled in the Legislative Assembly. Joining me today is Mr. Martin Goldney, Deputy Minister of Executive Indigenous Affairs and Secretary to Cabinet, and Ms. Miranda Bai, my Ministerial Special Advisor. Mr. Chair, the global pandemic continues to present ongoing challenges for governments, businesses, and people all over the world. Here in the Northwest Territories, we've been fortunate to avoid the worst of the health impacts and have been able to avoid the roller coaster of opening and closing as we've seen elsewhere in Canada. Recently, an updated Emergent Wisely was also tabled, and we've been able to ease self-isolation requirements and rescind the recommendation to travel only for essential reasons. The pandemic has, however, exposed and worsened a number of pre-existing social and economic issues in the territory related to employment, homelessness, health, education, broadband access, mental health and addictions, and others. These issues existed before the pandemic, and without intervention, action, and resources, they will continue to persist as problems into the future. The Government of the Northwest Territories enacted emergency measures and short-term changes to address many of these issues, and many cases with financial support from the Government of Canada. We have learned a number of lessons over the past 15 months. I tabled our government's Social and Economic Recovery Plan, Emerging Stronger, during the spring sitting of the Legislative Assembly. Through the Emerging Stronger plan, our government is applying the lessons we learned in the initial stages of the pandemic and adapting our existing plans and priorities to address the impacts of the evolving global pandemic situation on the NWT. This will enable us to establish a solid foundation for social and economic recovery and longer-term growth. Emerging Stronger builds on the commitments that were identified in our government's mandate that was established at the onset of our term by highlighting where the actions we previously committed to will support our recovery efforts. It also focuses on additional immediate actions the government will take to set a clear course for recovery based on the lessons we have learned from our response to the pandemic to date. The document highlights the specific immediate actions the government took at the start of the pandemic to respond to the crisis and provides an overview of the initial economic and social impacts of COVID-19 on residents and businesses in the territory. Finally, Emerging Stronger includes a plan with targets and timelines for actions discussed in the document. In addition to the input we received from this committee in the development of the document, we also sought input from Indigenous governments and provided briefings to the Business Advisory Committee and the NWT Association of Communities prior to releasing it. We also received feedback from the Yellowknife Chamber of Commerce, the Business Advisory Council, and the Dene Nation after the plan was released. On the day Emerging Stronger was tabled, we launched a web page focusing on the plan, including a link for residents to provide feedback. The page can be found on the Department of the Executive and Indigenous Affairs website. We are continuing to invite ideas from the public, Indigenous communities, non-governmental, and industry partners for further actions to assist in building a stronger social and economic foundation for our territory. The full duration and impact of the pandemic remain unknown at this time. We must remain flexible and responsive to challenges and opportunities that are beyond our control. The government of the Northwest Territories anticipates that the conversation around social and economic recovery will be ongoing and evolve as circumstances of the pandemic change. As a result, Emerging Stronger should be considered a living document that will be updated and reported on annually to reflect progress. Mr. Chair, we do have a presentation we'd like to share, and with the Chair's permission, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Martin Goldney to go through the package. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks, Premier Cochrane. Please proceed with the presentation, Mr. Goldney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe I'll go right to the line slide. But just first on the title, as the Premier mentioned, the document is subtitled Planning Our Economic and Social Recovery Together. As the Premier mentioned, that was by design, recognizing that we do intend to have ongoing conversations and collaborations as we work to strengthen the economic and social fabric of the Northwest Territories. So this presentation is meant to provide an overview of the document with a focus on the initial lessons learned and actions the GNWT plans to take in response. So when we were preparing this document, the GNWT reviewed economic and social recovery plans as available to date from jurisdictions across Canada, the States, and other parts of the world. I would suggest that this document presents an approach that is unique to the NWT in that it focused on the things we have learned from the pandemic so far and the actions and course corrections we can make in response. Building on our existing shared priorities as laid out in the mandate. In this presentation, we'll review how Emerging Stronger fits into the work we are already doing under our mandate, the GNWT's immediate response to the pandemic, some of the early social and economic impacts, the initial lessons learned, and our next steps. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this is a bit of a different plan than we've seen in other jurisdictions, and I think a large reason for that is when we were looking at other plans, we quickly realized that many of the themes, many of the actions, many of the priorities that are identified by other jurisdictions as being aimed at strengthening economic foundations were already identified by this Assembly as priorities early in the term of this government. We did have an ambitious mandate already set with a number of those priorities identified. So our challenge really was, how do we reconcile our current changing circumstances with our existing plans to strengthen the economic and social foundations of the territory. So we do encourage that the document be read with the mandate. We did try and highlight specific areas where there were existing mandate priorities. Maybe we missed a few of those connections, but I think some of the feedback that we've heard has been, well, what about this or what about that? The reality, though, is a lot of those themes and actions were already identified in the mandate, and we tried not to have this document be wholesale duplication of that mandate, but rather a document that works with that mandate and complements it. So next slide, please. So the document also included as an appendix an inventory of the immediate steps that the GNWT departments and agencies took to support residents and businesses to mitigate the impacts of the unplanned and unprecedented public health measures. So we did, there's a bit of a summary on this slide and a more detailed appendix in the document itself. But we wanted very much this document to be more forward-looking. So So that's why we put the information in an appendix. But we also recognize that it was important to have that context of what has been done to date, to provide, again, more of the context of some of those initial lessons learned. And I think it was worth recognizing that there were many things done to act quickly and make social and economic supports available. A lot of work done in very short order to identify and work with partners to provide necessary services, and continuing to work with the federal government to secure resources and the CPHO to guide recovery. That took a lot of energy, effort, and focus, so worth recognizing that. I think I did see maybe it was an editorial, a bit of reaction that our document seemed to be a bit of horn tooting. That wasn't the intent. The intent was to provide that context, which I do think is important to demonstrate to the residents of the Northwest Territories that the public service was very focused, very busy, providing those services and those supports, and we've learned some lessons along the way. Next slide, please. So we also wanted to include a bit of a snapshot of some of the economic and social impacts that we found. So a full assessment of those impacts will be undertaken at a later date once the pandemic has run its course and the impacts can be better understood in a broader context. In the NWT, social and economic well-being are very closely tied. So we did put that appendix with both of those indicators together to provide a bit of an overview of some of the things that we've found. I think it's also worth noting that the economic decline that we saw in 2020 should be understood in the broader context of the national and international economic recession and instability. Economic decline in 2020 was a continuation of weak performance in 2019 and unevenly distributed across sectors. The GNWT continues to monitor and seek support for tourism, aviation, mineral sectors. Industries and businesses that are reliant on non-resident workers also remain challenged by ongoing travel restrictions and labor shortages. The Emerging Stronger document discusses some of those early economic and social impacts in more detail, but among other measures we saw the exacerbated and accelerated decline in GDP with diamond production, resident employment and employment rates in 2019 and 2020, an increase in the number of income assistance clients during the initial months of COVID-19, an overall increase in NWT helpline calls between 2019 and 2020 in the early months of the pandemic, an increase in about 20% in monthly alcohol sales between March and October compared to the same period the year before. And we also recognized the importance of collecting that data and doing a better job with that information, so there'll be a little bit more to say about that as well. If I can just turn to the next slide, please. So a significant portion of the Emerging Stronger plan identifies key lessons learned and actions to implement going forward. When considering the actions, it's important to consider the GNWT's fiscal situation, ongoing work on the mandate, as I mentioned, as well as the core business of departments. So this slide and the upcoming slides outline those lessons and corresponding actions that will be taken. It should be noted that these actions are, again, in addition to actions that are complementary that were already identified in the GNWT's mandate. Next slide, please. So certainly one of the key themes that we found in our initial lessons was that the GNWT needs to continue to be able to adapt and respond quickly, efficiently, and in a coordinated way when serving our residents. I think I've said this before, but I don't think we're the only jurisdiction that surprised itself with its ability to put programs and services in place in a very accelerated way. We also recognize that we need to build a better foundation for more responsible fiscal policy, and the GNWT has started that work with a government renewal exercise that aims to better align our public funding with our priorities to achieve the best results for residents and promote efficiency within government. Any future new initiatives will be subject to performance measurements and public reporting, and work is being undertaken to develop tracking and reporting for existing programs. We've also committed to report quarterly on a range of social and economic indicators, as I mentioned, including child maltreatment and neglect, mental health and addictions, alcohol-related harms, family violence, and employment rate. A lot of the work to develop those social indicators and economic indicators is progressing, and we look forward to having a dashboard available online for residents to be able to measure progress. As I mentioned, I think another key lesson was the value of data collection and reporting to better inform decision-making and program delivery and provide information to residents on performance of government programs. If I can advance to the next slide, please. So another key lesson and theme in the document is really the importance and power of partnerships. We would not have been able to do what we did in the initial response without that strong partnership with community partners to help deliver the programs that were put in place. And I think this just reinforced, again, a bit of what we already knew. To get better results and work more efficiently and better, we need to continue to focus on those partnerships, and not just with Indigenous governments and organizations, but community governments as well, and importantly, the nonprofit and charitable sector. So the pandemic certainly demonstrated that the community partners are vital in the delivery of childcare, early childhood education, disability and long-term care, on-the-land programs, emergency response and other areas that comprise what some call the care economy or the caring economy. The pandemic highlighted the opportunity to strengthen those partnerships to better address the needs of our residents. So in response to that initial lesson learned, sorry, I've advanced a little too far here. The GNWT committed to establish an external advisory table to focus on strengthening the role and capacity of the not-for-profit sector and focus on expanding the caring economy, and continue direct engagement with Indigenous governments, including through the recently established NWT Council of Leaders, to ensure greater collaboration among the GNWT and Indigenous government leadership. Next slide, please. So the rapid deployment of sheltering and service supports in their early stage of the pandemic, designed to protect homeless or street-involved individuals, occurred in partnership with community organizations and demonstrated the potential that exists for deepening those partnerships with and within the community sector going forward. So the document identifies that in response to that initial lesson learned, the GNWT will conduct After action reviews with other system improvement initiatives, including for the COVID-19 incident management team, work with community governments to update community emergency plans and provide pandemic-specific hazard plan and essential service plan templates to ensure the inclusion of emergency sheltering and pandemic response needs. I think, again, a lesson learned not only in this jurisdiction but others, our emergency preparedness was not designed with the focus of a pandemic with as long-lasting and far-reaching public health measures as we have experienced. We've also committed to improve and expand existing emergency response training to municipal governments to include emergency planning workshops and tabletop exercises based on identified community risks, and an online webinar tutorial on updating community emergency plans. Next slide, please. So improving broadband infrastructure, again, the pandemic demonstrated this not just in the NWT but around the world, the importance of that connectivity. And just again highlighted that access to quality, affordable internet and devices is critical to health and social services, education and business. Broadband reliability and accessibility must be established for all of our communities. The period of time when the GNWTs and other government's workforces worked remotely confirmed that wide gaps exist in digital connectivity. Ongoing efforts to bridge the digital divide must advance in order to support sustainable long-term recovery. The GNWT industry and businesses could offer more services remotely, but these initiatives are only possible with reliable and affordable internet in all regions. So in addition to related actions in the mandate, the GNWT committed to continue to press for federal policy changes to ensure applications for investment recognize the NWT's challenges, to urge the CRTC to take action to regulate rates for internet services in satellite communities, provide ongoing portable subsidies to lower rates for residential and business internet services, review the terms and conditions of wholesale access by competing service providers, and make network improvements to enhance reliability. Next slide, please. So we also took lessons on the importance of meeting the needs for vulnerable populations, and the pandemic had an impact on residents' ability to meet basic needs as indicated by increased client uptake in income assistance during the first months of the pandemic. The GNWT also opened shelters in Fort Simpson and Hay River to support housing affordability during this period. The Transitional Rent Supplement Program was extended to March 30th, 2021. The budget for the Homelessness Assistance Fund was increased to improve housing stability for residents facing eviction or requiring housing. Funding was also increased to expedite critical repairs needed to 108 vacant units in rural and remote communities. The majority of these units have been repaired and allocated under regular programming. So the GNWT does recognize, though, that it needs to continue these efforts and treat some of these needs with the urgency required. So the GNWT in this document has committed to improve the existing income assistance program to ensure the types and levels of benefits and income exemptions are meeting the basic needs of NWT residents. Importantly, advance work on integrated service delivery by developing the framework to support change within our systems and exploring practical demonstration opportunities to improve timely and effective access to programs. To use key NWT-specific information to create an NWT approach to manage alcohol, accelerate work on the alcohol strategy, and review the regulatory changes introduced during the pandemic. And as I mentioned, also the importance of working with partners to accomplish many of these efforts. There's also a commitment in the document to undertake a review of the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation policies, a more comprehensive review to try and ensure that that organization is better positioned or best positioned to support improving social outcomes. Next slide, please. So, the pandemic did require a different approach to mental wellness and addiction recovery service delivery. So there were programs put in place very rapidly, such as community-based counseling supports that moved to virtual care. Due to the pandemic, the system is now better prepared to support virtual care options. While services have reverted to mainly face-to-face delivery, it is anticipated that the change towards virtual care will be lasting. So the inclusion of e-mental health services has proven to be more relevant in the pandemic when people could not come together face-to-face. The option to meet with clients virtually may mean less disruption to services going forward. So in response to this lesson, the GNWT will plan and implement a new electronic medical record system, including scoping options for improving the ability of patients to access information from their health records and providers, accelerate development of a plan to sustain virtual care solutions, some of which were rapidly developed in response to the pandemic, including improved phone and video-based consultation and e-prescribing. Next slide, please. So just as we saw changes in service delivery related to health and mental health, there was certainly disruption in education and childcare services. So that immediate and unplanned closure of schools and limitations on childcare just emphasized the essential nature of school supports offered and social supports offered by licensed early learning and childcare programs and JK to 12 schools. It reinforced the potential for expanded distance or blended delivery of post-secondary education program and reinforced disparities in access to the internet and digital devices among schools and communities. So in response to that lesson, the GNWT again committed to continue to provide post-secondary students with increased funding in the 21-22 academic year to assist with additional costs associated with online learning, to review the Student Financial Assistance Program to ensure benefits are supporting students to achieve their post-secondary goals with a special focus on removing barriers to post-secondary participation for Indigenous students, with changes to be implemented by the beginning of the 23-24 academic year. And starting in the upcoming academic year, increase access to post-secondary education opportunities at Aurora College, including through the continued expansion of online course offerings. Starting in the 22-23 academic year, expand and enhance Aurora College teaching and research facilities across the NWT, to provide more diverse post-secondary education opportunities for residents, including increased access to learning in every community, laddered through programming from literacy to upgrading to certificate to degree through the transformation of Aurora College into a polytechnic. Continued to defer to make optional large-scale student assessments such as diploma exams and the Alberta Achievement exams for JK to 12 students, and other measures. Next slide, please. So certainly another key observation, lesson reinforced during the pandemic was the NWT's heavy reliance on out-of-territory workforce. And industry and businesses continue to be disrupted by pandemic-related travel restrictions, although we hope to see the continuing lessening of those. But the GNWT has the opportunity to support workforce development through its infrastructure investments. So the document identifies that the GNWT will work with Indigenous governments, communities, and businesses to improve training investments and career pathways, provide regionally based career and education advisor supports to all grade 9 to 12 students beginning in the 21-22 school year to assist students in post-secondary decision-making and planning, invest in apprenticeships through the NWT Housing Corporation and Department of Infrastructure. Next slide, please. And there's also opportunity to build additional capacity with our capital planning. The GNWT makes substantial capital investments each year and is advancing major infrastructure projects. These will certainly be key drivers for our economy. And we recognize there's increased public interest and federal priority on green energy, climate change mitigation and adaptation actions, and ensuring a more environmentally responsible approach. So contract opportunities could be better distributed to create more equitable levels of activity across regions and stimulate the economy. So in recognition of this, the document identifies that the GNWT will accelerate the review of the GNWT procurement policies, including the business incentive policy, the negotiated contract policy, and consider the development of an Indigenous procurement policy. The GNWT will also invite Indigenous governments and businesses to be involved as equity partners in key strategic investments as those project opportunities arise. So there's also a commitment to accelerate the review of that of our procurement policies, and as mentioned, the potential development of an Indigenous procurement policy. And we did have to recognize some of this work is going to be informed by the work of a panel now underway to provide an independent report and recommendations on GNWT procurement that considers discussion points from engagements this month, and the GNWT will then review and prepare a response to that panel report. And engagement will continue throughout this process, and it's recognized that additional consultation will be required to meet our obligations, particularly our obligations to consult on any proposed changes to our practices and approaches respecting procurement to Indigenous governments. And these will have to happen before changes are made. But this review really is about improving procurement policies in the best interest of all NWT businesses, and the GNWT is looking forward opportunities to work with Indigenous governments and others to develop policies which even further benefit Indigenous and local businesses. Next slide, please. So we did mention that economics review, again, really highlighted, just as is the case across the country and around the world, that there has been very uneven impact on sectors. Certainly industries reliant on in-person customers and social contact, such as tourism, arts, entertainment, and recreation, accommodation and food services will have experienced the steepest impacts of the pandemic. So the GNWT is committed to assist the tourism, aviation, construction, hospitality, and mining sectors to position for survival and eventual rebound. Committed to working with the NWT tourism to reestablish a positive public sentiment towards travelers entering communities with a strategy to be shared this year. Continue to invest through NWT Tourism on marketing to Canadian domestic travelers and support businesses to compete for domestic and eventually international tourists once the NWT borders are set to reopen. Work with NWT tourism operators and businesses as appropriate to provide clear communication on public health criteria, including what's required to see the relaxation of measures. So we've seen some of that work already, and just gain a better understanding of what might be what might drive changes in travel restriction to allow operators to position themselves for rebound and to further open up. There's also a commitment to assist the tourism, aviation, construction, hospitality, and mining sectors and seek to be in a better position for survival and recovery. So in addition to implementing the regular suite of programs designed to market the NWT as a premier travel destination, build tourism operator capacity, increase tourism product and infrastructure, ITI launched a one-time program called Growth and Recovery by Investing in Tourism, the GRIT Fund. So through this program, $3 million was invested in recovery for tourism businesses in 2021. And the purpose of the program was to assist tourism businesses with either pivoting in response to the impacts of the pandemic or to support projects that would assist in recovery and were longer term focused. In addition, 2 new programs were also launched in early June 2021, the Pandemic Relief Extension Program, or PREP, for licensed tourism operators, and the Supplement for Tourism Accommodation Relief, the STAR program for accommodation providers who have 3 or more rooms. And these programs are designed to provide relief to tourism operators and accommodation providers who continue to operate at a deficit due to travel restrictions being in place. For the mineral resource industry, several COVID supports were introduced. The mining incentive program, specific amendments were made to the mineral incentive program, most of which are being continued into 21-22. And these included expanding eligible expenses to include COVID-related impacts such as isolation requirements, expediting and program logistics. Reporting deadlines have also been extended for some 1920 projects that were significantly delayed by the pandemic. And ongoing support will continue to be available through ITI's work credit program. So under the commitment to work with NWT Tourism to reestablish positive public sentiment towards travelers entering the communities, ITI has been working very closely with NWT Tourism on a variety of initiatives in that regard. And there continues to be investment on marketing to Canadian domestic travelers to address that need as well. And as mentioned, work has advanced and continues on providing that clear communication on public health criteria that will drive changes in travel restrictions and allow operators to position themselves for rebound. And you saw a lot of that reflected in the Emerging Wisely document. So just maybe quickly before I move on from the supports for the hardest hit sectors, I did mention that there is an economic kind of snapshot in that document online. But just for illustration, the latest numbers and where they show a decline and a rebound already. So for arts and entertainment and recreation, The 2020 GDP decline for that sector was negative 43.7%. Mining and oil and gas extraction, negative 43.2%. Accommodation and food services, negative 33.2%. There perhaps a bright spot in retail trade that's already rebounded before the pandemic levels and has increased 8.4%. Other areas where we saw slighter declines, less drastic declines than in the previously mentioned ones: education services, negative 6.6%. Professional, scientific, and technical services, negative 6.2%. Manufacturing, down 6%. Transportation and warehousing, down 6%. Information and cultural industries, down 3.8%. Construction, down 3.1%. Public administration, up a bit. Sorry, again, I advanced a little too far there. Bear with me. So under public administration, a slight increase of 3.1%. And maybe just a pause there to note that the NWT's large public sector did act as a stabilizing force throughout the pandemic for our economy. But we recognize that growing the economy through growth in public administration is not sustainable. Maybe I will advance from support to the hardest hit sectors to the next slide. Another key lesson from the pandemic was highlighting the need to better connect businesses to support programs as they became available and remove regulatory burdens to encourage entrepreneurship. We did find that residents were willing to support local and independent businesses that offer the goods and services they want to buy. And as restrictions were eased during the pandemic, retail sales, as I mentioned, and other service industries were able to rebound more quickly than those relying on diamond mining or visiting tourists. So as a result of this lesson, the GNWT did commit to work to better align business support programs and further examine our existing roles, resources, and support, starting with a business development workshop with lending partners, examine existing contribution agreements to ensure priority on northern benefit and investment, accelerate the work underway to reduce red tape, enhance business development and investment corporation financial programs, and expand investment options in response to changing needs of NWT businesses, while also advancing legislative amendments and improving operational processes there. There's also work underway to examine existing contribution programs, as I mentioned, to ensure northern benefits. The GNWT is continuing to take steps to better align the SEED program with the needs of entrepreneurs and businesses, and a more comprehensive review of that program is underway. And also looking for changes to better support our broader commitment to improve accountability, transparency, and access to all of our programs. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, nearly half of the NWT labor force is employed by the public sector. And while that has acted as an economic stabilizer during the pandemic, it really also emphasized the disparities between the effects of the pandemic on between the public and private sectors, and really just further underscored the need for economic development and diversification. So a lot of focus already in the mandate under that, but in addition, we committed to work with Indigenous governments, development corporations, the mining industry, and all regulatory partners to find ways to move proposed mine expansions and advance projects into production phase with community support. Work closely with the federal government and Indigenous governments and organizations to prioritize and implement remediation projects, access the potential for development of a remediation economy within the NWT while upholding the polluter pays principle and ensuring that operators remain fully accountable. Attract and facilitate grassroots prospecting and exploration in areas of high mineral potential. Work with the Conference Board of Canada to update the NWT labour market forecast and needs assessment to the year 2035, including consideration of the mining and remediation, tourism, knowledge, housing, infrastructure, and caring economies. Renew and implement our Skills for Success action plan. And there's also a commitment to launch economic diversification strategies for agriculture, arts, and film. Next slide, please. So under the next steps, we must recognize and retain our ability to be flexible and responsive to new challenges as they arise, but also new opportunities. So for example, the extent of the spread of COVID-19 variants and the impact that could have remains unknown, but we are very encouraged, of course, by our vaccine efforts, and we'll continue to encourage residents to take advantage of the availability of those offerings. But we also need to be very aware of our fiscal situation and our decline in revenues, and any new action needs to be carefully costed and evaluated. So the GNWT will also continue to monitor national and international situations closely. We'll provide data on economic and social recovery and invite ideas and further actions to assist in rebuilding the economy and improving social well-being throughout the Northwest Territories. So emerging strongly was really meant to represent a starting point in our conversation around social and economic recovery, and we'll continue these conversations with Indigenous partners, community governments, industry, the NGO and charitable sector, and residents of the Northwest Territories. So we are encouraging interested members of the public to provide feedback through the portal on the Department of Executive and Indigenous Affairs websites, or they can email directly to emergingstronger@gov.nt.ca. And I will also mention that we are trying to consolidate the GNWT's public engagement efforts into one landing page for our website. So we do look forward to doing more public awareness and solicitation of views as that website is launched, and the aim for that is in the middle of July. And we expect Emerging Stronger to feature prominently on that website as well. So thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe I will conclude there.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Goldney, and thanks to the Premier. Let's start that conversation right now. I believe there's some members that have some questions, and I'm going to go straight to MLA Cleveland. Start. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for the presentation. I know it's beautiful outside, and I really appreciate the Premier and Mr. Goldney taking time today to speak with us. My first question is, given that our population accounts for over 80% of our GNWT revenues through federal transfer payments, I was surprised to see our population not reflected within emerging stronger, both in the sense of retaining existing Northerners and also through attracting new Northerners. So I'm wondering if the Premier plans to address both of those within Emerging Stronger, and I am thankful that it is a living document so that we can have this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily Cleveland. I'll turn to the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Absolutely. I mean, that is why we're here. That's why we're still engaging. And that's why we call it a living document, was because we do have to. Things will change over the next 2 years. Hopefully they'll calm down a bit. One pandemic of government is enough. But we don't know what's coming in the horizon. So I do appreciate the comments for retaining and attracting new residents. That was a priority for the previous government, and I believe the government before that as well. So we will be including it into the next, as we do the next annual reporting and as we obtain feedback, because it's something that's a no-brainer and it should be in here. Thank you, Emily Cleveland.
Okay, thanks, Premier. Emily Cleveland, you've got another question. Please go ahead.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that. I think that speaking to our population numbers, given the revenue that we do get from the federal government, is a really important part of it, and there's lots we can do, especially on the side of immigration to the Northwest Territories. My second question is in regards to business supports. There's nobody else in the territory that understands what supports businesses might need than businesses themselves. And we're lucky in the Northwest Territories that we have active chambers of commerces. And we also, on the side of the GNWT, had the Business Advisory Council. And both of those organizations produce documents making suggestions of what they would like to see as far as economic recovery plans. The Business Advisory Council had their key challenges summary that they produced back in November now, and then the chambers have also responded with their feelings on Emerging Stronger. And so I'm wondering if the Premier plans to specifically address each of the recommendations that were made by those organizations. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily Cleveland. Premier, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Absolutely. We need to work closely with the business community as we move forward. We can't do this alone. The government of the Northwest Territories, as spoken by the Deputy Minister, is a large sector of the employment, the economy in the Northwest Territories, but it's not sustainable. So we do meet regularly with the business community, with the business advisory community as well. And in fairness, I would dare to challenge that probably in this government, the Minister of ITI has met more with the business community than in previous government. So we take it to heart that we can't do this alone, and we will continue to move forward, and their recommendations will be addressed either in the package or by explanation of why they're not in the package. So that work will continue. And anyone that provides feedback will also we will provide that courtesy that whatever feedback they give, we will be replying to them, stating this will be incorporated or the reason that it's not. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Premier Cochrane. That's good, because that was one of my questions, so you may be off the hook for that one. But I'm going to go to Emily Johnston next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Madam Premier and Mr. Goldney for presenting us today. I think one of the criticisms of many GNWT plans or strategies is they are not costed, and this one contains that same problem of it doesn't contain any dollar figures. And I've been trying to understand the root of this problem. Because I'll note, a week after this plan was tabled, we got a SUP for $7.5 million for the tourism industry. And then I think we got another $12 million for the airlines. And then we passed another of SUPs in the budget to support the social sector. So it's not as if it was impossible to take what we knew we was going to, eventually make it through the Financial Management Board and put it in the plan. And Minister Simpson has expressed the same concern that he always wants costed plans, but as far as I can tell, the ones that have came out in his time, such as the ART strategy, don't contain dollar amounts. And I believe what's happening here is we ask a department your department in this case, to make a plan or a strategy or whatever we call them. And then they have to try and go through the 9 layers of the financial management board before we can actually talk about dollars. But I think that causes a lot of frustration because there's plenty of things in this plan that cost money, and we know we don't have that money in some cases. So to put in there with, these support words without a dollar amount, it really just doesn't make it like we're having hard decisions. But can I just get from the Premier's point of view why we didn't put dollar amounts in this plan, or what is the barrier to releasing costed plans? Because I think the headline would have been a lot different with this. It would have said GNWT is spending $25 million, and that's, and then it's broken down how it goes. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Emily Johnson. Premier, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The reality of why it's not costed within this plan is our nature of government. We are consensus government. We're not party politics. If we were party politics, then it would have been the GNWT would have been identifying the costing within this. It would have been identifying this is what we are doing. But within the Northwest Territories, we adhere to consensus government, and I'm a big advocate of the consensus government, in all honesty, Mr. Chair. So within consensus government, if I would have said that we are going to provide $7.5 million to tourism, and we're going to do, I can't remember the figure, $14 million to airlines or whatever it was, and social sector, what is the role of MLAs, would be my question. So the MLAs within a party system are the opposition, but within a consensus government, they are not the opposition, Mr. Chair. Within a consensus system, we bring budgets to the Assembly twice a year, one for our capital and one for our mains operating in normal operations within the government programs. So, like I said, if we were a party system, you would have those costings in there that we are going to do this, but our system of government doesn't allow that. And in respect, Mr. Chair, I think it's a lot better when MLAs have input into where our budgets go on an annual basis as well. It makes for a better budget. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks, Premier. Emily Johnson, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I don't want to get into a nature of consensus government, but, in party systems, governments often say subject to parliamentary approval. They announce funding, and then they kind of put this pressure on the parliamentary branch to approve it or to wear it. And I guess that's I don't think that's inherent to consensus government, that a premier can't do that. To put it on regular MLAs, we are presenting this up, and if you vote it down, then you're wearing it, not me. I don't want to get into a debate of the nature of how consensus should operate. So I'm going to go to another specific example where we did cost something. And I've raised this a couple of times. In our mandate, it says we're going to increase the mineral incentive program by 50% over the next 4 years. And then it has cleared it by 10, 15, 10, 15% over the next each budget. And in the last 2 budgets, the mandated timeline to increase the mineral incentive program from $1 million has not occurred. And when I asked the Minister of ITI, she said something along the lines of, just because it's in the mandate doesn't inherently mean it gets approved by the FMB. It strongly supports that. And I previously raised this with you, and there was this, the mandate is a cost, and some of those decisions have to be made. And so we have to make tough decisions within the mandate. Can I just get an update on, there's a costed number within the mandate with clear timelines of when the money should be spent. We failed to meet that target twice. Are we going to meet that mandate commitment of increasing the mineral incentive program by 50%? And if not, why? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks. We may be straying a little bit from the plan itself, but I'll allow the Premier to respond. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When the priorities were done by this government and the mandate was done, it was before the pandemic hit. We all had high ideas, and we all had timelines that we thought were doable and goals that we thought were achievable. However, the pandemic hit, And a lot of resources went towards the pandemic, not only resources that were covered by the federal government, such as the Secretariat, but resources in education and health and ITI, and every single department was full out running to address the pandemic at hand. The Northwest Territories has around 45,000 people, as stated here before. Our revenues are contingent on our population, I mean, vast majority of it. So we have to work within our fiscal reality. So again, some of the ideas that were done in the mandate might not be achievable, but we have committed to doing an annual report. We tabled the last one, I think, in the last session. On an annual basis, we need to be honest within that and identify, and you'll see that in the next annual report, areas that we are slacking off, not slacking off because we don't want to do it, but because we don't have the financial resources, the human capacity to be able to address that. You'll also see within the annual reporting, as we make changes to this document, the Emerging Stronger, that some of those things that we have identified, for example, the 5.7 for tourism, might appear in our document because we would have that figure already passed by the Legislative Assembly. So like I said, this is a living document. It will change, but it is contingent on the fiscal reality, on what we can do as a government, and what we get passed in session, which is by consensus by all MLAs members. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks, Premier. I'll go and I'll check with Ms. Martselis. You're on the phone with us. Do you have any questions for the Premier?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On page 15, you ensure capital planning supports equitable opportunities, employment, resiliency. I'm just wondering about the whole business incentive policy, negotiated contracts policy, and consider, it says. It doesn't say it's going to develop an Indigenous procurement policy. The language is very weak, and I'm wondering why. And I'm also very concerned about the whole business and incentive policy, because the business incentive policy, when we put it forward, it should be those businesses that are actually, the ownership is actually in the territory, because that's not happening. Most of our money goes down south, and how could you build an economy when most of the money is going south? I have 10 questions in that one first question, but I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Ms. Martselis. I will let the Premier go ahead if you would like to respond to at least 2 or 3 points that Ms. Martselis raised there. That'd be great. Please go ahead.
Mr. Chair, I won't act like we're in the ledge and I can pick one of the questions. I'll actually try to address them all as she's brought forward. Within the Emerging Stronger, it does have a review of the business incentive policy and a review of the negotiation policy. It was addressed earlier in this government that the negotiated contract policy did not work. It wasn't being used in its original intent. It was being used inappropriately, in my opinion. And so we felt that we needed to also, if we respect Indigenous governments as equal partners and self-governments, as I always say, the key word in that is self, if we are true partners, then we had to, in my opinion, develop an Indigenous government procurement policy. However, in saying that, before we had brought that forward, we hadn't consulted with the Indigenous governments, Mr. Chair. So in this policy, you will see that it says, look at it. Since then, we have had discussions with the Indigenous governments. They are more than on board with this. We are beginning stage of doing this kind of work. So in the next one, when you see it, it will change the word from looking at it to actually implementing. Again, we will be changing it on a yearly basis as things change, being adaptable to the situation, which is a key lesson that we learned with the pandemic. The other thing that's working is, looking at red tape. That's also going on right now. In this policy, in the original mandate, a lot of that work was identified. However, it was spread over the 4 years of a term. Because of the pandemic, some of this work has been fast-tracked, such as the procurement reviews, etc. So I do know that the minister is already on this work, is starting this, and hopefully we'll see results from that soon. As for the Northern Hire and Northern Workforce, that was a concern in previous governments. However, again, the pandemic brought it to the forefront. People started to notice when people from the south came up and were taking jobs. Communities were saying, don't let them in our communities. So the economy was bad right throughout Canada with the pandemic. Businesses were failing. Some provinces were opening and closing on a bi-weekly basis, sometimes weekly basis. So everybody their economy was scary for all of us. That made us realize that we had to do what we could to secure as much business in the north for Northerners by Northerners. So that became a huge priority for us, and that is in our document, and probably became one of our bigger priorities in this government, more so than other governments because of the pandemic. And that will continue to be a priority for this government as we move forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks, Premier Cochrane. Emily Martellus, do you have a second question? Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think one part of the question was not answered very clearly, and that is ownership means people that are living in the north, and the shareholder actually lives in the north, and a lot of our even our monies that were given out a lot of the shareholders are down south. So, it's you have to be able to walk the talk, and sometimes you have to make tough decisions. But you know what? The north and the shareholders that are in the north, that are actually northern companies with shareholders living in the north, those have to be the priority, and I didn't see that this time. When I look at some of those funds going elsewhere and knowing that the shareholders are somewhere else, I don't think that's okay for the north, and I would like that corrected, because I think that we have to start walking the talk when we put these kind of documents. These are very high level documents and very general. They're not specific. I'm very much about knowing the detail and the specifics, and hopefully as we work together on this in the future, we would be more specific. But so my question is, I'm talking about the actual shareholder of a company who is in the Northwest Territory should be priority number one. And I didn't see that happening. There's a lot of companies that got help, and in some of the funds that were dispersed, that the shareholders don't live here. They live elsewhere. They live in other countries. So I have a real problem with that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Ms. Martellus. Premier, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You are absolutely right. So currently within the business incentive policy, we do allocate a certain percentage for people that are part of Indigenous governments here in the NWT, that live here, that have partnerships here. There's a whole range of areas. That work is just being undertaken now to change. So it would be premature to actually say this is what it looks like before we've actually engaged with the stakeholders. So you will see, hopefully fairly soon, because I know the work is starting now, a report, a what we heard report from the review of the business incentive policy from that work, and that work would be incorporated into our emerging stronger as we go forward. Some stakeholders, and I do encourage everyone out there who's listening, please provide feedback into to the review of our business incentive policy as well, because the more we hear, the more we'll actually look at addressing changes, and people have ideas and solutions that we don't have all the answers. So support us with that. Some of the money that we do have to support can't change. For example, we did support major airlines in the Northwest Territories. Their shareholders do not live in the Northwest Territories. but they fly our people and our residents in and out of the Northwest Territories. So without having road systems and other access to communities, we had no choice. So some things we will have to do because we don't have the capabilities in the Northwest Territories, such as major airlines. Those ones, if a pandemic hits or anything major like that, we would still have to support them. But the goal is to try to keep as much money in the North as possible. And that is what the review of the business incentive policy is about. And as that work is done, then that work will be transferred, not the whole thing, but transferred the concepts into this Emerging Stronger. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to squeeze in a question myself if I can. Regular MLAs, a number of us sat through the public accounts last week, and that covered the period up to just the beginning of the pandemic. You know, it ended, the last ones that we looked at ended April 1st, 2020. And I think there was some real clouds on the horizon, even during that period, where our debt is increasing, and you know, even the Comptroller General says our finances are unsustainable. That's before the pandemic. So I don't see, though, anything in this plan that deals with the issue of fiscal sustainability. And to me, that means things like tax fairness, looking at our revenues. There's nothing in here about revenue options. There's nothing in here about getting a better deal with Ottawa. You know, during the last federal election, two of the federal parties, and I'm going to call them out, the NDP and the Conservatives, both said that they were prepared to negotiate a different deal with our territorial government that would allow us to keep all of our own source revenues. I don't know why we're not using that as leverage, knowing that there's going to be an election this fall. So anyways, I was just astounded that there's nothing in the document about fiscal sustainability and looking at new revenues sources or getting a different arrangement with Ottawa. Is that something that can be addressed and changed in the plan now? Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, within the document, we do have a responsible fiscal policy within there. It's actually the first item in it. It talks about being efficient, coordinated, and evidence-based. We need to look at our programs. We have more needs than we have money. That is not, that's always been the case, and we can't continue on that. It's not sustainable. The auditor is correct. However, we also need to make decisions based off of best practices, evidence-based decisions. So the whole government renewal again, the finance is taking on in this government is about looking at every single program that we offer and to decide within it, developing performance measurements and measurable outcomes and providing reporting on that and deciding, does it make sense to offer a program that's costing millions and millions of dollars and only impacting 4 or 5 people? Or does it make sense when we're only spending a couple $100,000 and it's oversubscribed by many, many people? Those are questions that we are going to answer within the government renewal, and that is about being due diligence with the money we have on hand. As for the working with the federal government, I'd beg to differ and say that we've actually spent a lot of time in this government actually working with our federal counterparts, more so than I would say previous governments, more so than the one I was in, for sure. So we have reached out to the oppositions and other times. We've talked about where their platforms are, but we also work closely with the government that is in power now. And that has showed, in this government, we have got more housing money than governments that I was in previously. We have gotten within the budget, the federal budget identifies the North. So developing those partnerships isn't about just working with and using them as hammers. I talk to the ministers all the time and I've talked to all of the stakeholders. It's really easy to say no to someone that you don't like. So we could come in the angry force from the North, give us, we deserve, or we can come in and it's really hard to say no to someone that you do like. So we can come in and say, help us, because if you help us, this is how we're helping you. So we've taken that strategy, Mr. Chair. We work closely with the federal government. I think we have a solid, very strong relationship with the Prime Minister and the ministers, and they are taken to heart, and it is showing in the budget. When they recognize the Northwest Territories in a federal budget, Mr. Chair, I beg to say that that does identify that we've done a great job of lobbying and working with the federal government. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks. I'm sure we're going to continue this debate into the House, but I'm going to go back to Ms. Cleveland for a second round. See if Ms. Cleveland, do you have any further questions? Okay, well, why? Okay, there she is. Go ahead.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. I do have additional questions. I was just struggling with buttons. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My second question is just in regards, it was lightly touched on, so this might be a little bit of a stretch, but the GNWT has been working towards a homelessness strategy now for almost 3 years, since it was announced in September of 2018, and is something that still has not been released. And I'm hoping that this homelessness strategy will speak to kind of the urgent need of day shelters and also, I guess, supportive living needs of our street involved people. And right now we're looking at the closure of the Aspen. And over the course of our term, we've seen a really unstable solutions for our street involved population. And so I'm wondering, is there a plan of cabinet to address this and to come up with before the winter months? And I'm asking this now because I think it's incredibly timely and it's incredibly necessary to come up with solutions before winter. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Cleveland. Premier, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Working with homelessness, I mean, that's why I came into government. That is my background. We are committed to doing a homelessness strategy. I can't, at this point, I don't know when it's projected to be completed. The minister isn't here. We can get back to committee on that. However, homelessness isn't just about doing a strategy, and it isn't just about putting up shelters and day shelters. Homelessness comes from very many different reasons, most related to trauma. So you'll see within this plan, we are looking at strengthening our mental health, our addictions, and on the land treatments. We're looking at working with Indigenous governments more in that work, because I think that is key to it. We're fast tracking our alcohol strategy, I believe it's called. So, and addressing the mental health as well. So, and like I had said earlier as well, the federal government has given us $25 million towards housing in the last budget here. We've asked for more. We will continue to ask for more. So housing is one issue of it, but we also need to deal with the trauma that comes with it as well. So hopefully within all of these initiatives, we will deal with it, but homelessness is not going to go away. There will always be times when people are struggling in their lives. It's about providing a comprehensive package that people don't fall between the gaps. And that's what I'm hoping that we'll have by the end of this government as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Lisa's got a question. Okay, thanks, Madam Premier. Ms. Cleveland, do you have a second question?
I do have a second question, and it's one that, again, is somewhat related to the presentation today and is one that has come to me by multiple constituents that I serve, and it is in relation to the alcohol restriction that is still in place within liquor stores. It was introduced early on in March of last year in order to try and cut down on the amount of people that were in liquor stores when we were trying to still figure out COVID, and the restriction still stands today. And so I'm wondering if there is an intent to remove the alcohol purchase limit restriction that is in liquor stores. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Cleveland. Premier, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, that one I can speak to, even though the minister's not here. I do know that I do know that the minister actually, when she did the restrictions, met with us. I have a bi-weekly meeting with the Indigenous governments. It used to be weekly. We've moved to bi-weekly, where we get feedback. She came to us before she had changed the regulations, and the Indigenous governments, a lot of them were saying no alcohol period in the NWT. She had a tough job, because we also had people, especially in the major centre, Yellowknife, that were saying, what are you talking about? No alcohol in the NWT wasn't going to fly. So now the pandemic has kind of at the end of it, hopefully, and she's collected the results from it. And my understanding is that the results didn't show the benefit that they were looking for. The idea from the Indigenous governments was if you limit the amount of alcohol to be purchased, especially Mickey's, etc., that you would decrease the amount of bootlegging, and that was their major concern. However, our statistics showed that that did not happen. People moved from not buying as many Mickeys, but they were buying the larger bottles, and there were multiple sales. So she just actually met, we just met last Tuesday past. Weeks go fast. So just this past Tuesday, she had came to the Indigenous government meeting again that I had, and she brought forward the concerns, and she looked for feedback from the Indigenous governments, stating that the findings that she had, that's why I have this knowledge, is because I heard her spiel at that. And so she is looking at changing them. And again, she's going to have a fine balance. Because we need to make sure that we address the needs of all populations, of all communities. So I think that you'll see that those regulations changing in the near future based on the consumer feedback that she's getting now. Thank you, Misters.
Okay, thanks. I believe Ms. Semler's got a question or two now, so please go ahead, Ms. Semler.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. My question, and I think it kind of goes along with, keeping our workforce, and, we've talked about this, and I think MLA Cleveland brought it up at the beginning about keeping the workforce in the north, and where our healthcare, we've been, one of the things that, we've got hospitals, we've got health centers in every community, but we do not have a stable workforce, and I think that showed its ugly head again during the pandemic, the amount of staff that we had to bring in and trying, and having to pay out of territory staff for isolation before they could go into communities, and that cost a big chunk of money for this. But it also continues, and I've been raising it in the House, that we continue to pay this cost, that we're flying in people from out of territory, and instead of trying to incentivize them to stay here so that we do get those federal transfer on the amount of people that are living here. And, and I think that's something that needs to be strengthened even in this Emerging Stronger plan, is there's many other areas that we need to do this. And I'm just wondering if that plan, is there any movement on that plan to keep our workforce living in the north instead of flying them in and out? Thank you.
Thanks, Emily Semler. Premier, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Absolutely, we want to keep our workforce in the north, especially within our healthcare fields. We see the benefits of having, we all know the benefits of having caregivers that actually you can relate to, they understand your history. However, within this new Emerging Stronger, you will see under improving health services to care for all Northerners, you will see that we, within the pandemic, virtual care became a reality. And even before I got into government, I remember working with a doctor that I respect a lot, and he's talking about virtual care and the need and the ability and the prospects for it. Everyone knows that computers aren't my strong point. I'm a little bit older, but I need to do what I can. But the pandemic brought it to a forefront. And so virtual care became a highlight, and we worked fast on it. So within this Emerging Stronger, it does say that we are planning to sustain our virtual care, which includes phone, video-based consultation, and e-prescribing. The reason we didn't talk about bringing in, within this report, is per se about bringing in healthcare professionals and looking at the vacancy and our reliance on locums, Mr. Chair, is because it's in our mandate. we tried not to duplicate, but our mandate actions talk about, and they're not off the table. It talks about increasing e-health on the land and other mental wellness and addictions recovery. The mandate talks about reducing the number of vacancies and reliance on locums. Priority talks about increasing resident health care professionals by 20%. And, and the whole goal is to reduce wait times within that. So it's already in our priority. It's actions that we're working on. But in fairness, the pandemic also made a shortage of healthcare professionals across Canada. So we were in a hard, heavy hit time. Now that the pandemic hopefully is at the end, people will be, the workforce will be a little bit less stressed, and we'll be able to regain focus on this. But it's still our priority. It's still in the mandate. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks, Madam Premier. Emily Semler, do you have a second question?
Yeah. My next question is more related to, within the plan, it talked about housing and how fast we turned around new programs. We've got a lot of our homeless off the street, but now we've kind of let that ball slide again. But the problem hasn't gone away. And we talk about the root causes, and Madam Premier, you come from this background, and you know that, like you said it yourself, it's the trauma. But if you speak to majority of the people that are on the street, the issues is that the programs and services that are applied don't meet their needs. And so, looking at, and we keep bringing up northern addictions, and this is another thing that really hit us during the pandemic is the out-of-territory addiction, the wait list, and then the outbreaks in those places put our residents where they weren't able to attend. So I'm just wondering, within emerging stronger, moving forward, is there more of a plan to put more money? Because like you said, if we're putting more money where it's more needed and less where, so is housing and addiction going to be getting more money after this, now that we've seen what a crisis we had? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Emily Semler. Premier?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Absolutely, we do recognize that mental health and addictions is a huge issue for the Northwest Territories. We were number 2 in the worst situation in Canada. That's not something to be proud of. That's something to be ashamed of. However, like I said, it's a huge issue. It's not as easy as just saying we need a treatment center. Many people that are struggling with mental health and addictions, it's more than just a treatment center. It's to deal with their own wellness. So I think that you'll see within this that we talk about, working more with on the land, working more with Indigenous governments. We need to work in partnership on this. The governments throughout Canada have been trying to deal with this issue on their own for decades and decades and decades and have not done a good job. So maybe it's time to reset the agenda and work with Indigenous governments on this, which we are starting to work now, and actually listen to them and work with them, because they might have the answers. So we need to be open to that. As for housing, absolutely. Many of the programs don't meet the needs of people. Again, government renewal will catch some of them, but I was actually pleased when regular members in the House brought this up, and regular members held the Executive Council to account and got a commitment. And it's in the Emerging Stronger. It's one of the proudest things that I have in here, that we will do a complete policy review of the housing programs before the term of this government. The other thing that's not in this that just came up in the last meeting I had with Indigenous governments, where the Minister of Housing was there, and it's not here now, but it will probably be in the adjustments in our yearly report, is we just agreed to having a working group with all Indigenous governments. I put it out there, and ironically, every single Indigenous government put their hand up and said they want to be part of this working group. Not surprised. But this policy review for the Housing Corporation will not be done by the GNWT alone. It will be done in consultation, in partnership with the Indigenous governments, which I think is going to be new, phenomenal, exciting. May take a little bit more time than I want, But I think it is the way that we need to move as we move forward in all governments going forward if we truly respect self-government and see ourselves as a partner at the table. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks, Premier. So I'm looking at the time, it's 4:45, and there's probably a couple more MLAs that would have questions, so maybe I can suggest that we try to find a way to shorten up our questions and responses if we can. Mr. Johnson, I'm going to turn to you next. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I am cautious of this advisory council for the nonprofits. I think overall, the Business Advisory Council did not go very well. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. One is businesses and probably nonprofits move at a much quicker pace. And when they demand things of government, they don't understand our sometimes glacial pace of operating. And I also am hesitant to strike a committee that's going to make a bunch of recommendations that will cost a lot of money, and we all know how tight money is. I also don't think that we necessarily, it's some mystery as to the feedback they're going to provide. Our shelters need more money. They want their money in larger blocks. They want their money longer term. They want it with less reporting and with less applications. And the Premier knows that better than anyone, that, running the nonprofit sector and scrambling from funding pool to funding pool just adds anxiety. And I know there's a couple notes about the committee and reviewing shelter funding, but I'm hoping that before those meetings are struck, we can go with them with what we're proposing, which hopefully is some more money, and reviewing the funder pools to put them in longer term. Because I think if we don't go to those meetings with an offer, we're going to hear things, and it's going to take us 2 years before actually any budgetary changes are made. So if the Premier could just speak to what that item about longer term costs for the shelter is all about. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Emily Johnson. I'm sure you're going to be able to keep your next question a lot shorter, and the Premier is going to do the same. Thanks. Go ahead, Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to try, but again, NGOs and homeless shelters are my priority, so I'm going to try to keep it. Yes, one aspect of the NGO sector would be looking for long-term sustainable funding that they can actually use, but that's only one point of it, block funding. And I was with the NGO world for like 20 years, and one thing I resented when I was administrator in that world was the GNWT making decisions without me at the table, without even asking me. So again, they might not have all the answers, they might not understand the process, but they need to have a voice. That's what they've been asking for. So to take it off and say we're not going to have this advisory committee because we tried another committee and it didn't work, in my opinion, Mr. Chair, would be disrespectful. I would rather let's try it. If they decide they don't want to be at that table, then that's fine. But they were at a table because I was part of it, especially around homelessness. There was a committee that was brought up, I can't remember what it was called, and we met, every single administrator from the NGO met there. There was no government money promised, but we met and we had a say. And then the city of Yellowknife decided actually that they were going to get the homeless money, and they decided to do their own committee. And that committee of NGOs dissolved, and since then has never had a place to have a say. So I think let's try it, because when I was administrator, all I wanted was to have a place where I could have a say. So if it doesn't work, then that's how life goes. But I don't want to say it's not going to work before we even try it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Premier. I'm sure you can work with us. We'd be happy to look at terms of reference for that body and work with you. A number of us do come from the NGO world, so happy to work with you on that. I'm going to turn to Emily Johnson again for a short second question. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I'm not saying we shouldn't have a committee. I'm saying that I think we can all anticipate what their asks are going to be, and they're going to be costly. And I just would ask the Premier for the first meeting to come in and set out, what can the GNWT actually realistically get done in 2 years, and what are we looking at? Because we started the Business Advisory Committee, and everything in the world was put on the table all at once. And many of those things we just couldn't have accomplished, which led to frustration. So I just would encourage the Premier to bring some, specific proposals to that, because that it's a bottomless pit of money that is needed in the nonprofit sector. And thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Emily Johnson. Sounds like it was more of a comment, but if the Premier wants to respond, I'll let her do it. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Absolutely. We need to go in and be realistic, but at the same time, I don't want to, I've also been to many, many meetings before I came into government, and even since I've been in government, where the government talks way too long, and you get tired before you even get a say, and then you end up running out of time. So we will come in and we will be realistic. But the other thing that wasn't mentioned by the MLA is when I do groups with any Indigenous or any parties, Indigenous governments or the NGO, when I was Minister of Housing, Minister of MACA, I actually pulled them together for a meeting. I really try to make it a solution focused. So, and within that solution focused, then you actually find answers, and then we prioritize. So if you had, I remember the last meeting where we had, and there was every single room and every wall in the room was filled with flip charts. This is what they wanted. And then we took that and said, what are your priorities? And we came out with a couple. And so that's how I'd like to see that work done, is that we actually, not us going in and saying, this is our priority, this is what we can do, but being realistic, saying we don't have a lot of money, but things as working aren't working great. What can we do? What's realistic in 2 years? And what are your priorities? And hopefully coming out with a concrete action. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks, Premier. I'm going to turn to Emily Martellus. Do you have any further questions?
Mr. Chair, I just have a couple of comments. I know the Premier's heart is in the right place. When she talks about the majority of people of the NWTU are Indigenous and the Indigenous groups and the leaders that represent those Indigenous groups. And I know her heart is in the right place. I know her staff are working to make sure that Indigenous governments are heard. And that's really important to me, because as a former chief of Salt River First Nation, and looking around even in this community of Fort Smith or Stacha, Indigenous governments have to be able to contribute and be part of decision making. And that's not to say that the business community is not as important. It means that we all have to work together to come together to make sure that the economic plan is solid. And going forward, I look forward to that. And that is all I'm going to say. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Emily Martellus. I'll allow the Premier to comment if she responds. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Absolutely, it's important that we all work together with that. No one stakeholder is above the other. However, in saying that, though, Indigenous governments, if we look at self-government, will be taking care of ideally their own people, drawing down programs. So it is important that Indigenous governments are at the table as much as possible. So thank you, as well as all stakeholders, but there is a special place. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks, Madam Premier. I think we're getting close to the end of the meeting. I'm just going to offer a couple of quick comments if I can. And I said this in the House as well, that the diversification part of the plan I think is particularly weak. I'd really like to suggest that there be something in here about food security as well. We passed a motion in the House that food security is not even mentioned in here that I could find. I think that needs to be built in here, especially in light of getting ready for another pandemic, another sort of emergency. I think there's some great opportunities for forestry here, especially in light of escalating wood or lumber costs, construction costs. We can and should be doing a lot more in terms of local lumber production, particularly for housing and so on. The only thing I can really see in here about arts as well as kind of just we're developing a strategy is kind of a throwaway line at the bottom. If we're serious about diversification, we just need to be doing a lot more and not just paying it lip service, because most of the stuff in here is about more of the same, quite frankly. And, if this is really about economic recovery and building resiliency, more of the same, it's not going to work. Anyways, that's some comments, suggestions for me. and I'm sure we'll see an improved plan moving forward. But we do want to thank you again for taking some time on this Friday afternoon to meet with us. And, I think it's the beginning of a conversation, as Mr. Goldney said, and we'll continue this, I'm sure, into the fall sitting. But any closing comments from you?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess my closing comments are more to the people that might be watching this Zoom, I'm not sure, this presentation today. The Emerging Stronger is on the EIA website. We are hoping that you will take the time to actually provide your comments. Again, it's a foolish government that decides that they have all the knowledge and can decide the future alone. It's by working together, as shown by the pandemic, the amazing amount of work, not only the GNWT, the CPHO, the Secretariat, but by businesses and the public actually working together, got us through this pandemic, probably the best outcome in the whole of Canada, knock on wood at this time. So by taking your feedback, take the time to provide us the feedback into this Emerging Stronger document, and by doing that, then you will contribute, and by working together, we will emerge stronger and emerge better. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks, Premier Cochrane. So that, I believe, concludes the public portion of our meeting. Can I get a motion from one of the committee members to go in camera? Mr. Johnson, thank you. No objections. All right, we'll move in camera, but we'll take a short break to allow our guests to leave and the public transmission. But thanks very much for anybody in the public who's been watching, and of course it'll be posted to our Facebook page and other social media for folks to watch in the future as well. Thanks very much.